Good morning. I'm Jerry Mitchell, and I'm on the board of the George Wright Society. And it's my privilege this morning to introduce our plenary speaker, Kathleen DeanMoore. Kathleen is a philosopher, nature writer, public speaker, and defender of all that's wet and wild. Her work brings together the art of the essay, the wisdom of the natural world, and the moral clarity of philosophy to explore our place in the planet, and our responsibility for its thriving. Dr. Moore is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Oregon State University in Corvallis, where she teaches environmental ethics, philosophy, and environmental leadership. She's co-author of OSU's new Environmental Humanities Initiative and is founding director of the Spring Creek Project for Ideas, Nature, and the Written Word. Moore is best known as a nature writer whose essays question and celebrate our culture, our spiritual connections to wild, nurturing earth. Her newest book is Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril. It gathers testimony from 100 moral leaders who call us to honor our obligations to future generations and find a moral response to climate destabilization and species extinction. Other books include her 2010 book of essays, Wild Comfort, The Solace of Nature, River Walking, set on Oregon's wild rivers, Hold Fast, At Home in the Natural World, and The Pine Island Paradox. She's co-editor of 3 collections, Rachel Carson, Legacy and Challenge, In the Blast Zone, Catastrophe and Renewal on Mount St. Helens, and How It Is, the Native American Philosophy of V.F. Cordova. Her books can be ordered from your favorite independent bookstore. She also writes about the environmental ethics and moral reasoning for such journals as Conservation Biology and the Journal of Forestry. Kathleen made it clear to me that she is a nature writer and philosopher. She said things that suggest she would never presume to have your expertise or know how to do the job you do. But believe me, on those days when you wonder if you can remember what it's all about, her words can challenge you and give you the reminder of why you're there in ways that data and policy never can. Please welcome Kathleen DeanMoore.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here. And if you don't want to stand so early in the morning, there are chairs up front. And are you happy back there? Well, good. I'm happy here too. You know, Aldo Leopold said one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. That is simply not true. Yes, the world is deeply wounded, but we are not alone. And every night when the sun is setting and each of us falls into bed exhausted and despondent because we have not yet saved the world, the sun is rising on the other side of the planet, and other people are rising to the challenge of protecting and creating what's flourishing and beautiful. And so on this rotating planet, there is this great dawn chorus of committed people putting on their pants, rustling up the coffee, and doing this good work of defending the world's thriving. And nowhere do I feel that rising dawn chorus than at 8 o'clock this morning here with you folks. It's a remarkable thing. I have to say that you are my heroes. And I love to hang out with you. And I'll confess that on my high school, you know, when in high school you take a test to tell you what you're interested in? Yeah. I scored highest on forest ranger. I'm so proud of that. Of course, I went on to become a philosophy professor of all the blasted and benighted professions. Philosophers are not fun to hang out with. Why are you laughing? That's just simply fact. And where I go to regain my sanity is to the places that you're protecting. So thank you, thank you, thank you. To regain my sanity, yeah, I say that quite intentionally because back in 1960, Wallace Stegner wrote that wilderness, and I would say by extension all protected places, are geographies of hope, a means of reassuring ourselves of our sanity as creatures, he writes. And in the protected areas, in these soft meadows and below these mountains, a sojourner is called to find a kind of simplicity and joy and self-restraint. And in that sense, then I would say that yes, these protected places are a geography of hope, hope for human integrity and good sense. But dear God, protected places are really taking it in the chin, are they not? As global warming and fierce corporate recklessness are strengthening its grip on the land. So we better talk about that. This decade, I would submit, has become a race between the end of the fossil fuel economy and the end of the Cenozoic era. It has become clear that one of them has got to go. And because protected places are often created to save the most vulnerable ecosystems, it's no surprise that it's your places that are being hit hardest and first. These high, airy mountaintops and the steep forests. These last refuges of the specialized species, places of high drama and deeply felt significance. So where is the hope in protected places now? When the polar bear and the rotten ice have become the face of climate catastrophe? And where is the hope in those orange needle beetle-killed forests that are facing into the wind? And where is the hope in the shrunken, dusty glacier at the base of a raw couloir? I'm trying to figure this out. And as I'm trying to figure it out, my own protected place, the Mount Jefferson Wilderness in the Oregon Cascades, my geography of hope, burned to the ground. But actually, that's not right. It didn't just burn to the ground, it burned into the ground itself, into the soft duff, into the mushroom mycelia, and it burned even the roots in the ground. And it hollowed out this warren of tunnels so that when you walk there, even the earth gives way under your feet. So it's in this context that I get an email message from your own beloved David Harmon asking me to speak to this group about the sliding ecological baseline, which he believes is an existential threat to conservation. Okay, I said. We can talk about that. So, mapping a new geography of hope, sliding baselines, diminished expectations, and the future of protected places. What is the absolute import of national parks and other protected areas in these years when the sliding ecological baseline is falling so fast that the time has earned the name of the sixth extinction? I can't talk about how to save places, I can't talk about where or when or by what means, but I can talk about why. So let's just do that. And I hope that as we talk about this, you'll trust me, because we have to go to the dark side first and think a little bit about the context in which our work takes place. And then I will spend about half of my time this morning setting that up. But then I want to offer a different way to think about the cosmic importance of your work. And I do not say that lightly. The cosmic importance of your work. And I hope that will cheer you up. And if you disagree with me, that'll just make you mad or sad. So here's our challenge. I want to argue that it's worse than Dave imagined. Sorry, Dave. That we are dealing with a sliding ecological baseline, but that has resulted in a sliding moral baseline, and that has resulted in a sliding baseline of imagination, and finally, hope. And I will argue that the protected places, your beloved parks, have the power to block each one of these sliding scales, every one. You are in the business of saving us from the slides. So let's take these one by one. First of all, the sliding ecological baseline. According to the World Wildlife Fund, and I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, since 1970, 40% of everything that has the breath of life, plants, and animals has already been erased from the face of the earth. 4 out of every 10 beings. I'm talking about beings here, not species yet. The number of vertebrate animals has been cut in half. The beasts of the earth, the birds of the air, the fishes of the seas, amphibians, reptiles. Of these, freshwater fish, frogs, and shorebirds have it the worst. I ask my students, do you remember 1970? Of course they don't. So I give them a hint. This was the year when John Lennon announced that the Beatles were through. This was the year that Apollo 13 made that terrifying return to Earth from the moon. They don't remember that. I say, if you remember, then you were alive when there were about twice as many plants and animals, forests and fields as there are now. And if you don't remember 1970, you have spent your whole life in a world that has been recently stripped by almost half. And I will die in a world that is half as abundantly beautiful as the one I was born into. My children will tear out half the pages in their field guides and throw them away. And my grandchildren's picture books about hippopotami and penguins and old albatross will be as fantastical as unicorns. In protected places in the United States, I'm told, the situation is somewhat different, that the number of species has remained about the same. Am I right about this? But that the particular array of species has shifted toward the commonplace. So we're seeing both the impoverishment and the homogenization, the McDonaldization of ecosystems. So you see me giving you art when I have to talk about bad news. Nietzsche, the great philosopher Nietzsche, you know I'd get one of them in. The great philosopher Nietzsche said, "We have art in order not to die of the truth." There is a hint for interpreters. We have art in order not to die of the truth. So this is Van Gogh for you folks, but it's made of discarded cigarette lighters. I think I might die anyway. So how many people were alive today have seen any ecosystem in its full and glorious complexity? Most of us live in a stripped down, as you know, dammed up, paved over, desperately impoverished landscape, and over time this becomes the norm, the way it's always been, the way it's always going to be, the standard against which we measure gain and loss, gratitude and grief. So what we have here is the problem of the ecological baseline with 3 elements. The first is this ecosystem that is simplified and damaged and ransacked, perhaps replaced. Secondly, the collective failure of memory of what once was, but who can see what isn't there? Who can hear the vanished songs? And then finally, we have the use of this diminished place as the marker of what is normal, what is natural, and suddenly the world slips a notch. Diminished expectation, a shrunken sense of the possible. And this is what we have to resist, finally coming to accept that a desperately diminished landscape is the norm. But then what happens? Notice this. It's not just the landscape that's reduced, but our valuing of it. An ecological ethic is an ethic that's based on caring. And with each diminishment, we care less until we could not care less at all. Will anybody care about the Antarctic or the Arctic ice once the polar bears have gone south? The result is a sliding moral baseline, I submit. We ask so little of ourselves, caught up in an astonishing disregard for the quietly vanishing creatures and landscapes. But who can grieve the loss of what they never knew? The measure of our obligation slips down another notch. And who is holding the line? Not the environmental movement. The environmental movement makes a great deal of effort to tell us what we are against, but it has failed to tell us what we are for. I'm sorry that these are hard to see in this bright light and at this distance. This is the trunk of an elephant. So what we have is that we have replaced, you see the slippage, we've replaced an ethic of affirmation, an ethic of aspiration, an ethic of dreaming and envisioning with an ethic of regulation. So here's our standard now, most of us, for what we ought to do. How far can I go? How much can I wreck before someone finds me? But without a vision of full and thriving ecosystems, without something to really care about and devote ourselves to, where are we going to find this ethic of aspiring? I have a dream, I have a vision of a landscape. We can do better than this. That's tough. Well, people object when I say this. They say that is not right. We don't have a sliding moral baseline. In fact, the loss of species has created an occasion for a great moral leap forward. And the great moral leap forward is the Endangered Species Act, which in some ways grants plants and animals the right to life. People say, you know, that's like awesome. Well, I'm not the least bit convinced that the ESA honors the rights of plants and animals. Does it respect a being's rights when the government moves to protect a species only at the last possible moment before extinction, or when it saves the smallest possible portion of habitat? The Endangered Species Act, I would submit, for all the good that it has done in terrible situations, is stingy. It's miserly and grudging. It's the most last ditch of all possible ways to respect the natural world. What does it say about rights to save only the tattered remains of a species? And even if the ESA does manage to protect the tired, the poor, the wretched refuge of your teeming shore, to quote the Statue of Liberty, it doesn't even try to protect the huddled masses. So what of these great herds of buffalo? What about abundance? What about loping wolf packs? What about swirling flocks of trumpeting swans? What about migrating hawks in huge numbers? What about monarch butterflies by the millions and schools of silver salmon? The great abundance of life. Who is saving the great abundance of life and the wonder of their numbers? We eat away, we eat away, we eat away, we eat away until something's almost gone. And then we congratulate ourselves on being moral beings because we can find a way to save the stragglers. And then, almost unnoticed, comes the sliding baseline of the imagination. Who can imagine a truly healthy ecosystem who lives in a landscape of loss, no longer noticing? Even our sense of possibility has been strip-mined. I have written about this. I have written about children on the Oregon coast, and I think this is why Dave invited me. I'll tell you the 3 paragraphs. I'll read to you the 3 paragraphs that I think have me in front of you now. These children know mostly fish-poor, flood-stripped streams. Here all estuaries are fouled, and no river water is safe to drink. That's the way it is. Why should they think it should be any different? Children who have never seen an ancient forest climb the huge, crumbling, blood-red stumps as they might climb onto the lap of a vacant-faced grandfather. They look out over the ferns and the hemlock seedlings, unable to imagine what used to be. They don't remember waking up to birdsong. How can they miss a murrelet if they've never seen one? And when their grandparents' memories of unbroken forests fade and the old stories grow tedious, the streams of red salmon pushing into the river, and the photograph albums hold dry images of some other place, some other time, then another opening in the universe slams shut, and another set of possibilities disappears forever. Not knowing the wild rivers? A dying child's wish to the Make-A-Wish Foundation is to be able to ride a boat at Disneyland. And not knowing fields of wildflowers, a child gathers dandelions for her mothers, and aren't they the most beautiful flowers there ever were on a planet that once held 30,000 species of orchids? The simplification and homogenization of the imagination. One rabbit, one tree, one rainbow. And this is all the more impossible to bear when you stop to marvel at the extraordinary chance that we find ourselves in this extraordinary Cenozoic era when evolution has achieved its greatest fullness of flowering, what the theologian Thomas Berry called the most lyric period in Earth history. Imagine our good fortune to be born in the time of thrush song and wolf choruses and microscopic sea angels with tiny wings and whales that teach each other to sing, a time of crocodiles and butterflies with curled tongues and a bat no bigger than a bee. But here's Thomas Berry again. It's our generation that's witnessing the end of the era that we evolved in. My generation has done what no previous generation could do because they lack the technological power. and what no future generation will be able to do because the planet will never again be so beautiful or abundant. Which brings us to the last of the sliding baselines, the sliding baseline of hope. You see the end of this litany? I hope you see the end. So at the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, maybe 80% of the species vanished, including most dinosaurs and many of the small creatures. I guess the question is it possible that we're living through an extinction event of equal power? If so, what is the cause? Just walk outside and lift your eyes to these very hills, or graze into the valleys, or walk into Walmart, for God's sake. Deforestation, a dramatic loss of habitat, over-harvesting of the oceans, poisoning of land and water. Shall I go on? I shall not. And what causes that? A way of life. A constantly growing, all-consuming culture, driven by extractive industries that have few moral and almost no legal constraints. It is madness. It's madness, the trades we make. And unless something stops us, we'll get to your work in a minute, unless something stops us, we'll keep on converting living creatures into dead commodities. We trade deep mossy forests for uselessly large homes. We trade meadows miraculous with butterflies for an industrial park to manufacture My Little Ponies. We trade singing marshes for another Kmart parking lot. It's madness, this consumption, this eating up. We trade fence rows and goose sloughs for yet more golf course grass seed. We trade spotted owls for typing paper. We trade old oaks for turning lanes. But the most terrible trade is the transmogrification of plants and animals into human flesh. Daniel Quinn says since 1970, that same 1970, the biomass of the human species has gained 50 million tons. It came from other members of the community of life, and as a result, the world is losing 150 species a day, turning 150 species a day into human fat and gristle. And when they are gone, they are irretrievable. What can we hope for now? I want to read you, if I may. How am I doing? Yeah. I want to read you an essay that I wrote, a little tiny piece of it, that I wrote when I sat down and said to myself, okay, Kathy, what do you hope for? I mean, realistically, what do you hope for? I call this the call to forgiveness at the end of the day. And the one thing you need to know about it is that the date line is May 25th, 2025. All those years, the Swainson's thrushes were the first to call in the mornings. That's when I would take a cup of tea and walk into the meadow. Swallows sat on the highest perches, whispering as they waited for light to stream onto the pond. For years, there were flocks of goldfinches. After my husband and I poisoned the bull thistles on the far side of the pond, the goldfishes perched in the willows. The garbage truck backed down the lane, beeping its backup call, making the frogs sing even in the day. Oh, there was music in the mornings all those years. In the overture to the day, each bird added its call until the morning was an ecstasy of music that faded only when the diesel pumps kicked on to pull water from the stream. Evenings were glorious too. Just as the sun set, little brown bats began to fly. If a bat swooped close, I heard its tiny sonar chirps just at the highest reach of my hearing. I don't know how many frogs there were in the pond, thousands, 10,000s. In the years when the frog choruses began to fade, scientists said it was a fungus, or maybe bullfrogs were eating the tadpoles. No one knew what to do. When the bats stopped coming, they said that was a fungus too. When the goldfinches came in pairs, not flocks, we told each other the flocks must be feeding in a neighbor's field. The fields were as empty as the perfect emptiness of a bell, the perfectly shaped absence ringing the angelus, the evening song, the call for forgiveness at the end of the day. As it happened, that was the spring when our granddaughter was born. I brought her to the pond so she could feel the comfort I had known there for many years. Killdeer waddled in the mud by the shore, but not so many as before. Ahead of the coming heat, butterflies fed in the mud between the cracks, unrolling their tongues to touch salty soil. I held my granddaughter in my arms and sang to her then, an old lullaby that made her soften like wax in a flame, molding her little body to my bones. She fell asleep in my arms, unafraid. I will tell you, I was so afraid. Poets born thus, writing of the heartbreaking beauty that will remain when there is no heart to break for it. But what if it's worse than that? What if it's the heartbroken children who remain in a world without beauty? How will they find solace in a world without wild music? How will they thrive without green hills edged with oaks? How will they forgive us if we let frog song slip away? It isn't enough to love a child and wish her well. It isn't enough to open my heart to a bird-graced morning. Can I claim to love a morning if I don't protect what creates its beauty? Can I claim to love a child if I don't use all the power of my beating heart to preserve a world that nourishes children's joy? Loving is not a kind of la-di-da. Loving is a sacred trust. To love is to affirm the absolute worth of what you love and to pledge your life to its thriving, to protect it fiercely and faithfully for all time. Ring the angelus for the salmon and the swallows. Ring the bells for frogs floating in bent reeds. Ring the bells for all of us who did not save the songs. Mother of God, ring the bells for every sacred emptiness. Let them echo in the silence at the end of the day. Forgiveness is too much to ask. I would pray for only this, that our granddaughter would hear again the little lick of music, the grace note toward the end of a meadowlark's song. Meadowlarks. There were meadowlarks. They sang like angels in the morning. Sliding basslines. But maybe it's worse than that. Has she no mercy? Maybe there's no such thing as a baseline anymore. Maybe we're witnessing the disappearance of the baseline in the face of climate change and the extinction of the normal. The extinction of the normal. People say, is this the new normal? Everybody asks, is this the new normal, this chaos? Well, we may never see normal again. What stands against this? God bless you, that would be you. Protected places are very few places, some of the very few places where all four of those sliding baselines are blocked. And this is your work, this is what you do every single day in blocking these slides of hope and imagination and full, glorious ecosystems. In blocking those slides, you create this new geography of hope. So this is the work of the world. This is what the world is agonizing over. This is how the world is trying to give birth to a new way of thinking about how we live on this earth. And helping to birth that new view, essential to birthing that new view, are these protected places, these places of profound sanity on this planet that's reeling under this pathology of greed and short-sightedness. And I want to say that even if it's wounded, a landscape, your landscapes, are drawing the line. And quite a line it is, this boundary between the protected areas and the areas that are without the protection from the industrialized growth economy's war against the world. This is essential work. This is essential work of imagining, why does it matter? So I want to point out to you, and maybe this is presumptuous of me, but I want to tell you what I, as a citizen who enjoys these places, who desperately needs these places, see as your work. So I think that let's talk first about stopping the harm. Like a fence, the boundaries of the protected areas contain a landscape, your landscape, but even more important, they exclude a landscape, and this is why I value them so much. The park, a park, any protected place is testimony to the human will to say, no, the extractive industrial growth economy will not cross this line. Reckless disdain for the natural world has no place here. This landscape is valued in itself for its own sake, not for the profit that might be wrung from it. Fracking pads must stop short of this Red Rock Canyon. And oil wells must stop short of this Arctic mountain range. Water-sucking mines must stop short of this desert spring. Cattle must find a different place to fart and belch, mostly, except for some places. A protected place echoes with moral affirmation. It echoes with moral principle. There are business plans that are destructive and cruel, and they will not do business here. And inside this line is a vision of what a desert and a marshland and a forest and a community can be if we don't wreck it, for heaven's sake, if we allow it freedom to grow to its full beauty and its ecological richness. And so protected places are proof of the possibility of human restraint during a time when you wonder if there is any restraining it. It is not a small thing. The protected places are places of natural transformation, but they are primarily, in my opinion, places of human transformation. Protected places are one place where you can go on God's good earth, where you have little choice but to be your best self. It is simply against the law to be a greedy pig in a park. It is simply against the law to steal or vandalize whatever you want from a restored and protected march. So the sojourner in these protected places is called to a kind of love and self-restraint that's rare in life. And this seems to me to be a fact of great importance. A week in a protected area is proof that a human being is capable of being a good and decent citizen of the earth. We go to the parks to practice being good people. And the surprise is that when travelers cross the boundary of your park, they have the ability, humans have the ability to slip from one level of being to another. From people who are surrounded and obsessed and dependent on multitudin of stuff torn from the earth, they can be transformed in crossing that boundary into people whose greatest pleasures are simplicity and a close connection to something that's greater than they are, something wiser and more powerful. And if there is not hope in that proof of the transmutability of human character, I don't know where it can be found. Also, crossing the boundary into the parks is crossing a philosophical divide as well, because protecting a place affirms a new understanding of the value of these lives of urgent thriving, crawling all over each other and burrowing into every crack. The fate of these lives, the park says, is not a matter of indifference. It's not a matter of economic expediency. These lives are the irreplaceable consequence of planetary creativity over 4 billion years. They have value in and of themselves. So now I quote Dave Foreman, a wonderful environmental activist, a wild man. The protected place presupposes that, of course, we have an obligation to wild things of all species, today and tomorrow, to honor their intrinsic value, and thus to act only in ways that keep whole the beauty, integrity, and stability of the earth. Those who want out of that obligation will have to fully show how it's okay to snuff life for short-term, selfish ends. This shifts in the park, in the protected place, it shifts the burden of proof in a strong and mindful way. And those who would shatter life will have to show in a deep, wide way why a careless, carefree, uncaring behavior is good. And that is pretty hard to do. This, I think, projecting here, is the pledge of the protected places. Not another mountaintop, not another rainforest, not another estuary, not another prairie, not another mighty river can be traded away for cash, not in the place I'm protecting. These are not industries to take or sell. They belong to the future of the everlasting earth. And I want to also say that there's no doubt of the geophysical worth of protected places in a time of climate change. The hope is that healthy forests, healthy soils, entangled banks, and breathing forests, all these things, the more they're present on the planet, the more carbon dioxide they can suck from the air. And so to the extent that protected places save intact ecosystems and then serve as carbon sinks, of course you know this, it's the great hope of a reeling world. A sane policy, I think, would rapidly expand protected land Not asking, is this pristine? Not asking necessarily, is this untrammeled? But in order to protect it, asking only, does it breathe? I also see you protecting what remains. Extraordinary work. In these dangerous times, it's essential to protect and restore and grow and preserve and hold on to what we've still got. You know, Noah. Noah knew that whatever survived the great flood, that's what would repopulate the world. The lions and the elephants 2 by 2. And now millennia later, the world is going through a biological bottleneck as brutal as God's fury in Noah's time. And whatever species make it through, that's what the world will be made of. That's what the world will be made of. Noah protested, I'm old, I'm tired, why me, O Lord? And haven't you done that? Oh Lord, I am old. And everyone is against me. But the answer is, why you? Because it's got to be everybody, and it's got to be you in particular, because you have the responsibility for the stewardship of these places. And so all of us are asking, what ark can I build? What habitat can I save or restore or create that's going to carry these living things into the future? My friend David Oates wrote, it comes to me that every good act might be an ark, no matter how small. Every good act might be a widening arc of consequence, incalculable. There have to be flotillas of arcs, uncountable. Tiny handmade ones and massive ones, science arcs like battleships, and garden arcs like rowboats, all set into the forward river of time to sail, if possible, through the narrow part of the hourglass of our era. There will be arcs for fungi, arcs for megafauna, grandstand wilderness arcs with million-dollar funding, and anonymous arcs, memorials of lost passion. Arcs like Moses adrift in the bulrushes, arcs like coracles of Irish monks ferrying their manuscripts to safe places, seeds and flowers, babies and oldsters, spores and flagellates, dirt clods and lumps indistinguishable. And then what? To touch, chance-wise, on dry land and start the world anew. Yes, I say to David, well said. We have to do everything we can to stop the flood, or at least to lessen it, to keep it from washing over the mountaintops. And that's the first and the most important thing. And then we have to save what we can, fishing it out of the waves and bringing it to safety. Thank you for doing that work. And now we have to invent a better way. Honestly, our problem isn't with renewable energy or farm fish or any other of the increasingly desperate ways we have to save our way of life. The problem is with our way of life itself, and a culture that prides itself on accumulating wealth instead of sharing it, a culture that gobbles up the fecundity of the planet instead of nurturing it, an economy that throws its own children off the bridge. Any economy of infinite extraction will kill off its sources of sustenance. So our work is not to save this way of life. Our challenge is to save the sustaining world from this way of life's destructive power. And so the challenge is to invent and model ways of respect and restraint that work with rather than against the living earth. Only place where I have seen this truly modeled are in the protected places and the national parks. Only there have I seen a world turned on its head, where all the creatures are respected. All of the creatures have rights. It's an astonishing thing. I saw this most remarkably in the Galapagos Islands, where all the animals were free to do as they please, and the people had to be careful and stay on the path. You know, it was just, they had the right to life and liberty and, and the right to pursue happiness in their own lunatic ways, and those rights were absolute. So in the Galapagos Islands, in a national park, there were hierarchies of size and power, but there were no hierarchies of value. Everything in the park is worthy. Everything in a protected place is, every fractal layer is necessary. Never have I seen as complete a repudiation of the idea that human beings are separate from the rest of the world, that we are better somehow, that we are in charge, that we are the point of the whole thing. So here in the protected places, we're allowed to imagine living in a very different sort of relationship with the natural world. So here's the most important thing I think that you do. Your boundary, the boundary of your protected area, seems to me to be the boundary between an old way of looking at humans in relation to the earth and a new way. When a person crosses the boundary, they cross from this old vision, the old vision of humans as individuals, separate, better than, superior to the rest of the world, into a world of interdependence and interconnection, a world where everything is valued and everything is necessary. That's a really important thing, to be on that boundary. And if you think it's brutal on that boundary, that's because it is. That any time a society makes this shift from one worldview to another, by worldview I mean answers to these questions: what is the world? What is the place of humans in the world? And how then shall we act? It seems to me that we are in that point right now where we're crossing from one worldview into another. And that time, when one set of stories about who we are and one worldview grinds up against another, it's an unstable and a dangerous time. And this, I think, is true of the time we live in. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. The facts that people encounter and the feelings they directly experience, they don't fit the story we were bound to, and we know better. But the new story isn't fully formed. And who could make sense of this tectonic trembling? And when they feel the ground shuddering under them, the old story of exploitation and extraction struggles more and more violently for control. And the old story becomes bigger and more complicated and more insistent. It's a profoundly insecure time. It's a time of bullies. It's a time of shouting. It's a time of unbelievable stupidity. And then something happens. There's some big fact. Somebody else shows us a new way, and the old story falls apart, and the new story emerges to take its place. Philosophers call this a paradigm shift, this sudden shift from one fundamental understanding to another. No one knows where that kind of paradigm shift begins. In Copernicus's workshop in Poland, in Selma, Alabama, in Tiananmen Square, in the nation's protected parks and other places? I think so. The story that's being played out inside protected stories is a story that matches what we now know about the way the world works. It's a story that emerges from evolutionary and ecological science, that validates what we most deeply value and answers the human yearning for connection to one another and to the astonishing earth and to the ongoing future. An ecological, ethical account of human kinship in a world that is connected, interdependent, finite, resilient, and beautiful. This is what I see unfolding on the land in protected places. It's a demonstration, it's a playing out of a new way of life that measures what is sensible and good. It's an acting out, it's being acted out in every protected place on this planet. It's a great experiment that you're conducting in the next worldview. It's a great experiment in how we're going to have to live on the land if we are going to continue to do that. You are ground truthing this new philosophical view of who we are in relation to the world. So here it is. And I will end with this, which I call to be the moral declaration of the protected places. Here's what I think connects what you're doing on the land with what we deeply value and with what we must do. Because we understand the world's systems and beings to be interconnected, we realize that all flourishing is mutual and that damage to any part of the whole is damage to the whole itself. That's the foundation of justice. Because we understand the world is interdependent, we gratefully acknowledge our dependence on one another and on the life-giving systems of the earth. That's the foundation of compassion, worked out on the land in the places you manage. Because we recognize that the earth is finite, we embrace an ethic of restraint and precaution to replace a destructive ethos of excess. This is the foundation of prudence and sanity. Because we understand the planet's systems to be resilient, we are called to take every possible step to stop the harm and undo the damage we have done. This is the foundation of hope. And because the earth is beautiful, we will defend it against those who would wreck it. We will defend it fiercely and faithfully for all time. Thank you so much for your work.
hot? It is. Thank you, Kathleen. Thinking? We have about 30 minutes before we need to leave the room. Natalie is in the back with a microphone. It's your turn. You may have questions for Kathleen. You may have stories you want to add to the discussion, comments that you want to make. And now's your time to do that. And would you please give your names, your agency affiliation, or if you have one, or university, and proceed.
My name is David Bird. I'm a professor, emeritus professor of wildlife biology in McGill University in Canada. I've just spent the last month traveling around in your parks camping, and I must say that I'm really, really impressed. They're fantastic. They're well run, and you should be very proud of them. My question to you, Kathy, is I don't think there's a person in this room who wasn't moved by your talk. I certainly was. I'm just wondering, I can only hope that you have been invited to give this talk in a room full of Fortune 500 businessmen, because we are all on board with what you're saying, but the people who are not necessarily on board, they're the people we have to get the message to. And I guess I'll leave you with a question. I was in the Monterey Bay Aquarium talking to one of the docents who had been there quite a number of years, who was talking to one of the scuba divers feeding the fish, and she was very passionate, and they were talking about how to preserve the oceans, and I went up to her after, and I said that I fear that the world's 7 billion to 9 billion people are going to gobble up everything in the oceans, and what can we do about it? And she told me in exasperation, she said, that's the question that no one wants to talk about in all of the information being a part of the public, and that is how to deal with the growing numbers of humans on the planet.
I told Jerry no questions. I told him only call and comments. I travel all over the country and I speak to the choir. And I think that's a very important thing to do. Those are the people I want to talk to. They are by far the majority of citizens in the United States, people who care about the world and are concerned about climate change. The people who deny climate change, the people who are wrecking the world, are a minority and an increasingly small one. The problem is that the people who identify themselves as concerned about climate change, concerned about extinction, are not walking the talk. And the reason to talk to this choir is that the choir is primarily hypocritical. And that it's easy to say, oh no, everything is going to hell, but it's harder to say, I'm not going to be part of it. I will refuse to allow myself to be made into a foot soldier in extractive industry's war against the world. If we could call people who are already caring, already concerned, if we could call them to action, to political action, sometimes to direct action, the battle is over, it's won. It's not that there aren't enough people who care, it's that the people who care aren't doing anything. They're not even talking about it. So I have this plan. You know how on Veterans Day in Canada, our Canadian friend people wear little poppies in there to say, I care about peace, I care about this. We need to at least have some sort of visual expression. If we can't speak, we need to have some sort of blue or green poppy or something that we can wear so that I can identify you as a person who cares, and that we can form a community then of caring. So I think strategically, it's not worth our time to deal with the very small number of people who are against the world, but we have to call the rest of us to action. And I don't mean like recycling, although I think recycling is a gateway drug to environmentalism. We have to call them to political action. And if it's in the streets, that's where we have to go.
Thank you. Others? Bob, I'm going to walk the microphone back to you myself.
Hi, I'm Bob Krummenacker. I'm with the National Park Service at the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore in Wisconsin. Thank you for the words of optimism. And in your talk, we sort of went to the trough and came back up at the top, and I think it was really helpful personally. But I want to set a context. Many of us work for the National Park Service in this room, and one of the real paradoxes of working for the National Park Service these days is that on government-wide surveys of employee viewpoints, we end up having absolutely dismal morale. And the rationalization that most of us give to this is that we are so passionate and we have such high ideals that they couldn't possibly be met, and therefore we're really depressed all the time. We had a director, Horace Albright, in the 1930s, that when he left his post, he gave a farewell address, something we don't tend to do anymore, and he said, "Do not let the service become just another government bureau. Keep it young, clean, vigorous, and strong," which most of us think meant don't become bureaucrats. Some of why our numbers are so dismal, I think, is because Mr. Albright is probably rolling over in his grave because we've become very bureaucratic. So my question for you is, in the face of organizational challenge where our own processes and systems work against many of the positive things that we're all trying to accomplish, if you could offer us some words of optimism and resilience of how to put up with a daily grind while we're doing such important work that we all believe in so much.
Once again, I said no questions. I don't know how to answer the part about bureaucracy. As a professor in the university, which is a dismal bureaucracy, I dealt with it by leaving. I do not recommend. I really do not recommend that. Stick with it, you folks. We need you there. I don't understand bureaucracies well enough to know or be able to explain the tragedy of having an organization that we all, to have an organization with goals that we all support and have people working in that organization to fulfill the goals, and then having this disconnect through the bureaucratic nightmare. I don't know the answer, but I will say this about hope and about holding on. Barbara Kingsolver says, if you run out of hope, get up in the morning and put it on again with your shoes. Bill McKibben says, if you are hopeless, you're not working hard enough. I wouldn't say that to you. I would say this instead, that we've got ourselves in a crunch, and it's just by illogic, because we think that we have only two, or we feel only two options. We feel, because we are in this Western worldview that is driven by the future. It's very odd, this notion of focusing on the future around the rest of the world, and particularly the utilitarian way of dealing with things where we can't even value something unless it has good consequences. So if it doesn't have good consequences, we can't show that it's right. That's a false way to think about things. So we say, on the one hand, I could have this kind of blinding hope. Everything is going to be fine regardless, so I don't have to do anything. On the other hand, we have this terrible, debilitating despair. Everything is going to hell, so I can't do anything. And so we're caught in this dichotomy, but it's a false dichotomy, because between this blinding hope and the blinding despair, there is this broad middle ground that is called moral integrity. And it's a matching between what you do and what you believe is right. You don't get up and go to work in the morning because you think you'll save the world or conquer the bureaucracy or bring back a species on the brink. You go to work because you're doing work that you think is right and good. And so the whole point about moral integrity is it is not based on the hope that we can save the world. It's based on this conviction that with moral courage, we can make our lives into works of art that express our deepest values. And I know I'm speaking philosophically and probably idealistically, and I don't really know what the grind is that you're facing. But I hope it would help a little bit to know that you're doing things because they're right. And that if you don't focus on hope so much, of transformation so much, that it might provide this kind of very beautiful lifeways For the first time this morning, I am seeing skepticism in your faces.
Bob, that was a good one.
Morning, I'm Stephen Woodley, and I'm with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, if you've ever heard of that. I was struck by your call to engage the like-minded rather than to fight the forces of darkness. And my story is about, at the World Parks Congress in Sydney, which took place this past November, there was a survey done by the Zoological Society of London, and they wanted to talk to normal people about how much nature should be protected. There's lots of fora in the world where experts and governments talk about how much should be protected. But this was to do human on the street discussions. And the surprising thing was, we have 15% on land protected and about 4% of the oceans protected right now. But when people were asked, and this was done across several countries, they said 50%. So there's a huge disjunct between official view versus citizen review. And this was 50% on land as well as on water. That's my story.
You all were able to hear that? Yes? Okay, that 50%, that when people were asked how much land should be protected, they generally said 50%. Does that surprise you? Does it? It doesn't surprise me. People are grieving these days, I think. People are grieving their disconnect from their sources of sustenance. And I think that a lot of the things that are destructive forces are grief work. You know, the endless shopping, the endless tick, tick, tick on the machines are ways of closing their eyes to their losses, which are cascading. The bird song, the connection to wild, the quiet, the night sky. And even if people aren't saying it, don't have it at the top of their minds, I think that it is deeply driving people to yearn for connection. We all yearn to be taken back in. I think it's part of human nature. So I would even propose that that maybe that statistic is expressive of deep human needs expressed in that yearning. It also could be an expression of human pragmatism. You know, we want to live through this thing, and we understand the absolute essential roles that the healthy ecosystems play.
Kathleen, my name's Farrah McGlone. I'm with the Park Service. You've mentioned, and other people throughout this conference so far have mentioned repeatedly the concept and the idea of story. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, how can we capitalize on art and story to transform this worldview? I mean, E.O. Wilson says that one of the biggest problems we have in the world today is the fragmentation of knowledge. Is story a means of achieving synthesis, and how can we do that? Maybe there's some practical thoughts on what we can do.
I wasn't catching every word of your question. Are you saying, do I see or how do I see the role of story in?
Yeah, how do you see the role of story? But then, you know, what maybe some practical thoughts from you for how we can use art and story to transform this worldview? Again, thinking that Wilson, amongst many, say fragmentation of knowledge is one of the underlying causes for the problems we face. Is story a means of achieving the synthesis? And maybe what are some practical thoughts on how we can do that?
Yeah, you know, it strikes me as interesting about our culture is that we use only a very small part of our brain. You know, we are very good at observing and experimenting and describing, but we, I think, have underutilized the other parts of our mind, which are to imagine, to grieve, to celebrate, to dance, to rejoice, to regret, all these other things we can do with our mind, which are hugely powerful tools for change. And that one of the things that a story can do is it can, in a very personal way, bring all the forces of the human brain, the human heart, the human feeling into play. Now, I know that scientists are particularly reluctant to do that, but I think we have to get over our reluctance to engage the emotion. That we really have to, that we will end up if we do end up with a sustainable system, it will be based on love, and it will be calling on people to love, and it will be based also on grief at the losses. And I spoke to the industrial foresters not too long ago, and they said, you know, we agree with everything you say, but we wish you wouldn't use that L word. And I said to this person, you know, what L word? I thought he was talking about liberal. He says, no, love, love, love. Don't talk about love. We're industrial forester, for God's sake. And I go, tell me a story about the land you live on. And these people, all of them wanted to tell their story about the land they lived on. I wasn't telling them a story. They were telling me a story. And they all had some sort of deeply meaningful connection to a place maybe their grandfather moved to, maybe long ago. Maybe they hoped for it for their sons and daughters. And even if they were reluctant to say the L word, they certainly expressed it in their stories. So one practical suggestion would be that you think maybe a little bit less about telling the story of the place and asking for stories, and setting up systems where people can record their own emotional response to a place. There is a great deal of power in that, but there are interpreters. Interesting job description, interpreters. As if the country, the landscape, were a foreign country and we had to help people. No, people deeply immersed in it, but they do have to be given the chance to speak the language. I know you asked me for something practical, but philosophers don't do practical.
Good morning, Ernesto Enkerlin from the World Commission on Protected Areas and Monterrey Tech in Mexico. You said at one point that we shouldn't only worry about the pristine, which I happen to agree with, but I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on that in terms of what Stephen commented, nature needs half because people need half. So how do we get to that one half of nature protected in some way? And the second part of the question is, how do you view the role of the US in which the parks have become part of the culture? They're a social construct, but in the case of the US, they are part of the culture in America. What's the role in the global arena to achieve nature needs half around the world?
The notion that we need to protect the pristine places is absolutely true. We must, we must, we must. The notion that we can only protect pristine places seems to me to be self-defeating, and that there are many different kinds of places with many different kinds of values, and they all need to be protected. I'm just not an either-or kind of girl. I just think that these places have intrinsic value and they have instrumental value. They are cultural and they are natural. They are pristine and they are the nearby, perhaps even the nearby spoiled. But all of them can be part of the heritage of the earth, and that if we could give up this notion that we're going to have very strict standards for what we save, and just start saving things wholesale in the backyards, in the churchyards. I'm calling for a new sanctuary movement. I want the churches to step forward, as they did with the sanctuary movement when they were welcoming immigrants or refugees from Nicaragua. I want them to step forward with a new kind of sanctuary movement where they get rid of their lawns and they make them into bird sanctuaries. You cannot come into God's house without getting seeds in your socks. I mean, that's the point, that everywhere everything should be a sanctuary movement. And after you transform all the green lawns of the churches and the gardens of the churches into gardens to feed the poor and into sanctuaries for the birds, now all the people who belong to that church need to be part of the sanctuary movement. I mean, the protected places, the notion that parks are the jewels is true, but it can't work against the notion that we have to do it everywhere and by every means.
Thank you. I'm Tom Gilbert. I retired from the U.S. National Park Service, but I've had the great fortune of working in different parts of the world with protected areas, particularly in less developed countries.
Would you bring the microphone up to your chin? Thanks.
Thank you.
People saying
Is
they
this
can't
better?
hear. Thank you.
I'm just saying that I've been very fortunate to have worked in national parks in different parts of the world. And in follow-up to Ernesto's question too, I want to point out, even though that the United States has been a leader in national park movement throughout the world, we have a very, very small international park office. Very few people who are doing an outstanding job. And there's an opportunity to expand that program, for example, in connection with work in the Peace Corps, with the U.S. Agency for International Development, do a much, much greater job. And that's the point that I wanted to make.
Thank you. Well said. That is, we're part of a larger world, and there is so much to save all around the world.
I see cogs turning.
Hi, it's me again, that mouthy Canadian from up north. I feel compelled to make a couple of more points that may be irrelevant. I'm glad you raised the subject of churches. But first, I have the great pleasure of having retired to live near Robert Bateman. I'm sure a lot of you know who he is. And I had the great pleasure of hearing him speak recently up in my new town. And his feeling is that he's actually turned into a bit of a grumpy old man. Instead of just giving a talk where he talks about his art and the pleasure he derives in doing it and why he does it and so on, he now rails against the injustices of the world toward nature. And he feels, and I agree with him, that one of the biggest, hopes that we have for the future are our children. And he feels that, and I couldn't agree with him more, that if you look at our children today, they're burying their faces in electronic screens, and that parks are a great place to get them out there in contact with nature again. I remember as a boy, I used to do some not so great, nice things to wildlife when I was a little kid growing up, but I was still out there, enjoying them. And the second point I want to make is that at the risk of being branded a heretic and being tarred and feathered and sent back north across the border, I must say that I'm not particularly big on organized religion. I never have been. I respect other people's religions, and if it helps them to get through life, that's great. My religion is the spirituality of nature. It always has been, and being kind and respectful to other people. And as far as I'm concerned, your parks, my parks, are my church. And that's where I go to basically spiritualize. And if I must say, to wrap up, if there ever was to be a new organized religion with no bricks and mortar churches, but parks and so on, and if it had a leader, someone the nature of someone like Kathy, then I would join that church.
I once asked a colleague of mine who is a theologian, what was spirituality? And he said, okay, here's how it goes. Spirituality is to religion as love is to marriage. Spirituality is to religion as love is to marriage. And so when you think that you are a spiritual person, even though you don't belong to a church, that makes perfectly good sense to me, because it tells me that you are driven by this love of these places. And I think that you're quite right, that if we can help our children fall in love, if we can build into them the capacity of connection to the natural places so they can fall in love, then I think that would be a huge step forward. I think that what the industrial growth economy is doing is an absolute betrayal of the children, and it's what drives my work.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you very much for this talk today. And I really appreciate the message of restraint and sort of posing the parks as a model for how we might be able to interact with the world. And I'm just wondering, since we've spent a lot of time this week talking about the centennial of the parks, if you can give us some advice as the park system moves into its second century about things that we should be doing or should not be doing that would help strengthen that model or make that model perhaps more pervasive. Thank you.
I was reading some of your work, and one of the proposals was that in the year of the centennial celebration, every fourth grader would learn or have some sort of contact with the parks. I thought that was a great idea. So it's about spreading the word, isn't it? It's about the invitation. It's about the opening up. It's about bringing in people of all cultures, people of all ethnicity and races. It's about the coming together of people in these beautiful places. And I don't have particular ideas for you, but I would love to be invited into a think tank or some kind of brainstorming thing to help think of that sort of plan. I don't have particular ideas there, but in a general sort of way, because we've come to the end of our question and answer period, and we know we do have to move out of the room rather quickly, let me just close, if I may, with a quote from Clarissa Pinkham Estes. And I think it's particularly apt for this question and this moment in this extraordinary group of people. She says, "Do not lose heart. We were made for these times. Yes, for years we have been learning, practicing, been in training for, and just waiting to meet on this exact plane of engagement. I recognize a seaworthy vessel when I see one. There have never been more able vessels in the water than there are right now across the world, and they are fully provisioned and able to signal one another as never before in the history of humankind. There will always be times when you feel discouraged. I too have felt despair many times in my life, but I do not keep a chair for it. I will not entertain it. It is not allowed to eat from my plate. I hope you will write this on your wall. When a great ship is in harbor and moored, it is safe, there can be no doubt. But that is not what great ships are built for. The parks are a great ship, and you are under sail. Thank you.